Well, my first story is about Linda Freeman. Actually, when I was living in Ottawa in the early 80s, we were very friendly with Linda. We lived in the same neighborhood. She used to come to the parties that we had with the South Africans when we had meetings. And what I can say is she's a very mean dancer. Right? Okay, Oxfam. In the news lately, of course, for the wrong reasons. I'll get to that in a minute. In the 70s, Oxfam Belgique, Oxfam America, and Oxfam Canada were kind of franchises of Oxfam GB, Great Britain. We used to call it Oxfam UK. They insisted on Great Britain. And we were franchises, and we were basically fundraising for projects that that Oxfam GB did. In the early 70s, Mayor Brownstone, who was heading up the political science department in U of T, staged a coup in Oxfam and basically declared that this was an independent Canadian organization. And the Brits could go to hell. So that was basically the line. And then Oxfam, the people in Quebec came up and said, well, you can't have an Oxfam Canada without an Oxfam Quebec. So these two new organizations started. And the first thing Oxfam GB did was sue Oxfam Canada for the name. They wanted to take the name from us because obviously that was the brand name and that's the way you did your fundraising. So it was a big legal battle in which thousands of dollars were spent just to retain the name. We won that battle. So in the meantime, I was in Latin America. So my head was in Tupamaros and Mothers of May Square and Nicaragua. And so I didn't really know what was going on when I arrived in Canada in the late 70s and got a job. And I suddenly realized I, of course, knew what was going on in Southern Africa, but I had no real clue about what Oxfam was doing or what the Solidarity Movement was doing, and so on. But I was lucky. I had 3 mentors. There's one of them right there, Judith Marshall, Paul Puritt, who we used to call Paul Purist, and Susan Herlick, who we used to call Susan Holix. And those 3 mentored me into the very complicated scenario of liberation movements in Southern Africa, not only the ANC and in Zimbabwe, but also Lusophone work. And so I would go down with them on these project trips, and they taught me the ropes. And that was very, very, very useful. And without them, I would have been lost. I probably am still lost a bit, but so the next stage was the debate within the community. Just let me tell you about the structure of Canada. At that time, as you remember, David, we had money for development education. So that meant we could have offices across the country. And we had a very strong network of offices, and especially in Eastern Canada, in Newfoundland and the Maritimes generally. And so that was, they were demanding that we did something more on Southern Africa. Our regions were demanding that we because they were involved in the Solidarity Network out there, and they wanted to know what we were doing at the center. What we were doing was, we were funding the ANC office in Toronto, we were funding various refugee camps in Morogoro in Tanzania, we were funding camps in Botswana and all of that. So we were doing that kind of stuff, but we were having some doubts, I must say, or at least I was, as to whether this was enough, that we should be perhaps doing something more. And then Judith Marshall, once again, took a trip inside South Africa. And she came out and told us, and Ticklesack and all the people that were involved, that, you know, there's some very interesting stuff going on inside. There's FOSATU, there's the United Democratic Front, there's information groups, the Glenn Moss types. There's a lot of stuff going on. Maybe we should consider working inside. And then we were faced with the issue of the boycott. and especially most strongly, I think the Secretary Solidarity Committee were keen on that we shouldn't break the boycott. And I remember, who was the guy who wrote Graceland? Paul Simon came to us, and he was appearing at the forum in Montreal, and he wanted to meet with some members. I think it was through SIDMA. He wanted to meet with some members of the Canadian Anti-Apartheid Network to talk about stuff. So we met him in the Canadians' dressing room, which was quite a thrill, obviously. And he said he had made a mistake. He had appeared in South Africa and put on a concert there. And he was finally waking up to the fact that this was a big mistake. And could we, as the anti-apartheid movement, talk to the ANC so that he could be forgiven? So this was a very interesting. Of course, we did talk to what was his name in Toronto? Joe Soligi? No, Joe Soligi? Solugi, sorry. We used to call him Joe Soligi. Anyway, so we talked to them and said, can you forgive him? And I'm not sure what happened at the end, but you know, that was just one of the more examples of the boycott, what we should do, how could we actually operate in South Africa without breaking boycotts and so on and so forth. And of course that was the time when Tickle-Sack and Secretary Solidarity Committee were having their discussions about what that meant and so on and so forth. And in effect, because I was working with Judith and Paul and Susan, Tickle-Sack almost became my project committee. So I was obviously influenced by the brilliant Mr. Saul and the others in Tickle-Sack to push for this working inside. So we decided to do it. We moved inside and I had a Brit passport, so I was able to go in quite easily without a visa. And I would literally go in there with dollars in my socks, because you know there was all sorts of machinations with the state to stop NGOs getting funding and all of that. So it became quite an adventure for me, and I loved it. You know, personally I loved it because it was risky, it was adventurous. But then I started to meet people from civics, from trade unions, all sorts of people, and I don't know, they were different from meeting with the Liberation guys. The Liberation guys knew what they wanted. They said, look, the whites are in power, we've got to take over. We've got to take that power from them. So the debate was around power. Whereas inside, the debate was around what's going to happen afterwards? What are we going to do with these townships? And we worked with the Urban Sector Network, if you recall, Judith, who were looking at new plans for the townships, for the whole of Joburg, rather than the white part and the black part. And so people were thinking about new formations, they were thinking about social issues, and so certainly for me, they were talking more about social injustice than simply power. Now that may be an oversimplification of what the Lib movements were thinking, but that's certainly the impression we got. And when we were having this struggle with the inside-outside, we called Thabo Mbeki, who was in New York at that time as the rep for the ANC, and discussed it with him, and he came to Toronto, and he actually had a discussion with the Solidarity movement and said, we think it's a good idea, you should do it. And then I went to Lusaka to talk to the ANC about it, and they said, it's a great idea, but pass the money through us. And I thought, well, yeah, it makes sense for them, but it's not possible for us, because I remember in John's book, he talked about this soft money coming from the Canadian government, perhaps to appease their other line on corporate involvement and so on. And we were getting access to that money. And in fact, we were being approached all the time by External Affairs and CEDA to take money for work in South Africa. And it was a nod, nod, wink, wink. You do what you will with it. We won't say anything. just put it down as legal aid. So we had access to all this money, and as John also said, we approached it with trepidation in your book. We didn't. We grabbed it. We thought it was great. We had all this money and we could do what we liked with it, which was wonderful. And so that's what we did, and we funded all sorts of things. We funded civics and Fosatu and other trade unions, and we funded a lot of stuff. And eventually, as we went through this, we ended up funding a very large election monitoring team in 93? Yeah, 94. So for us, it was a big success, and it fed our regions in Canada with something very, very concrete, and we started to bring people up from inside South Africa into the Canadian milieu and tour them across the country. I don't know if you all remember Afropix, Paul Weinberg. They had a photo exhibition which they framed beautifully and shipped up to Canada. And we put it right across the country, and it appeared in all sorts of art galleries all over Canada. And so these were the kinds of things we could do because we were there on the ground. We could talk to them and negotiate and get the deals going. That's where I met Roger Southall, actually. All right, 5 minutes. Okay, so that was one of the reasons, anyway, we went inside. And another one, a name I must mention, who you all know, Stephen Gelb, who, although sadly he had to do his PhD in Winnipeg, nonetheless was on the ground, and he helped us an awful lot in making contacts and even clandestine meetings with ANC people and all of that. So it was really important to have that person on the ground to help us find out what was what. So that was very handy. So that's what Oxfam ended up doing, and it fed our regions, and our regions were very strong. Our program was very strong, and we were all very excited. But then suddenly, after the elections, it kind of, what are we going to do now? And we're still trying to figure that one out. There were a lot of women's groups that we still funded, and various community groups. We did a lot of work with economic development in the townships, trying to set up small businesses and all that. But somehow it wasn't the same, and that's when I left it. Because, as you can see, this was a big adventure for me. So I was, really excited about it. But after that, it was a bit tame. So I ended up in the Balkans. So I'm a storm chaser, exactly. So, and before it was Tupamaros and Mothers of May Square and Nicaragua, and then Southern Africa. But I always put my heart into it, at least, and made things happen. So that's the Oxfam story. Oh, and just in terms of this Haiti fiasco, we always figured Oxfam GB was an old boys network. And we never worked with them in a compatible way. And so we're not at all surprised by what happened in Haiti and their attempt to cover it up. But we do see a conspiracy theory in that the right-wing press in the UK, after the Davos report on inequality by Oxfam UK, they must have been looking for something. And they found it because Oxfam was so stupid as to leave a hole in their defenses, if you like. So they exploited that, and because they were the media, they could make the story happen every day. And my sense is that they were trying to silence that voice. And that was the great thing about Oxfam GB, that they had an advocacy department that was really good. On the ground, it was another thing, but their advocacy was excellent. And I think to silence that voice is a big triumph, for certainly in the UK, for those guys. And it'll have its repercussions in Canada. But basically, Oxfam is fucked because of that, right? And now they're going for the UN and Save the Children and all of that. So there's a big move on to get at the aid community because of this particular case of Oxfam, and it's obviously raising its head everywhere, and it's very common, and it's terrible stuff. But in terms of the politics of aid, it's a very, very negative step. But that's to square the circle. When Mayor Brownstone broke off from Oxfam GB and created an independent Oxfam Canada, it's now, I understand, although I've been out of the game for a while, it's now come full circle. And Oxfam GB have recaptured the franchise. And that most of the projects that Oxfam Canada are doing now are in South Sudan and Wonga Bonga and anywhere you can think of that we've never even heard of. But they're all Oxfam GB projects. So it came full circle. So there's that period of about 15, 20 years, well, mid-70s to mid-90s, when Oxfam Canada was truly independent, a member of the Solidarity movement, very political, and did really good work. But now that's been lost again. So if John is right, and that there will be a future struggle in Southern Africa, we're going to need Mayor Brownstone to get off his wheelchair and do it again. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I'm going to talk without the mic.
Oh, you can have it.
No, come on. You keep it down at your end because I can be loud. Thank you both. Really, really interesting, very detailed presentations, and both in different ways, coming at the question of what is to be taken from that history and its legacy in the contemporary era. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so if you'd like to approach the mic, that'd be great. We'll take a collection as we have been doing. Yeah, please.
My name is Judith Marshall, and I have a question for Moira and a little PS to David's story. Moira, I'm just curious whether Ticker, at the point of elections, had any discussions about continuity and any